Welcome to the Harvest 2020 Spot Farm Results Week. The live stream session will start shortly. Before we begin, we want to remind you of some housekeeping. You will stay muted throughout the live session, so we can't hear you. The session is scheduled to be either 1 or 1.5 hours long, including questions. To ask the speakers a question, use the stage chat found on the right-hand side of your screen. Please do not ask questions for the live session in the main events chat. This session will be recorded and will be available to watch again on the AHDB Potatoes YouTube channel and the AHDB website. At the end of the session, we will provide you with a unique basis and Noroso code, which you should keep note of for each session that you attend. Don't forget to apply for points using the basis and Noroso application forms, which can be found in the reception area. Join the conversation online by following AHDB Potatoes on Twitter and use the hashtag SpotFarmResults2020. Finally, if you have any issues with the conference platform, contact the team on events@ahdb.org.uk. We hope that you enjoy the Harvest 2020 Spot Farm Results Week. Your session will now start.
To this latest segment in the 2020 Spot Farm Results series we've got. This morning, with those of you hopefully joined us, we had some really insightful discussions around desiccation, and then just there at 12 o'clock we had a really good deep dive into PCN trap crops. And we're going to keep the ball rolling, showing some of the work we've been doing, looking at weed control with fewer activities. This year we carried out a demonstration rather than a full replicated trial at Spot East. But as you're all be aware, a global pandemic of COVID came along and that put paid to getting people out on farm. But nonetheless, we still did our best to capture content. We have a video to show you of some of the work, but it was all good work. So I would now like to invite Mike Shapland, farm manager from James Foskett Farms, to join me. Hello, Mike. How are we doing this afternoon?
Yeah, good afternoon, David. Good afternoon, everyone. Yep, all well, thank you.
Good. So, Mike, you very kindly, as a host of Spot East, agreed to look at some herbicide work on the farm this year. You were involved, obviously, earlier this morning in the desiccation chat, and there was a lot of focus around when the approval was lost for Diquat about Reglone, but there wasn't that much thought given to retro or front-end use of Diquat in the process, and that was pretty much the basis of what we wanted to look at.
Yeah, that's right. I think that's probably a fair comment. And I think there's been a lot of focus on how we replace Diquat during the desiccation process at the other end of the season. But as all growers are aware, it formed an integral part of weed control at the front end of the season. So from my point of view, we are growing on predominantly light sandy loam soils on the East Suffolk coast. We're very capable of growing a wide range of weeds, plenty of polygnums, lots of mayweed, groundsel, charlock, annual meadowgrass, other grass weeds, and occasionally fumitory and things. So we have our reasonable share of weed challenges. So for me personally, it was a good opportunity to see how we could best employ Gozai and Shark and the timings of those to try and avoid compromising crop development. So it was a good opportunity to see it up close at first hand, really.
Yeah, no, that's quite right. And because one of the big things was obviously the changes from a Diquat label to some of the other Ppo inhibitors is the time of emergence when you can still use the crop. And that was the one thing we want to look at. So apologies for those of you that have seen this video earlier in the season, but this is a video we captured of the trial and we used back in our webinars throughout the season. Just a quick recap. So if we cut to the video now, we'll show you what we were doing at James Foskett Farms this summer.
I'm Tomalin, I'm an agronomist, advised James Foskett Farms. Planting went well despite a wet winter. We thought we were going to have a really difficult planting, but after the first 10 days, planting went really well. But we've been left with very dry soils, which for pre-packed potatoes where we're trying to wet up now for scab control, in these dry conditions we're taking 2 applications of water, which is using valuable resource that we need for the crop going through the whole season. Herbicide residuals have been a little bit poorer this season, principally because it's been so dry, and the soils, particularly the soils I work on, are sandy soils, and in the dry conditions the herbicides don't form a seal, the residuals, so weeds will get through, and we're certainly seeing that at the moment. This season with potatoes, we've got a mixture of work, but some of the work on the spot farm site, we're looking at herbicides, in particular contact herbicides, and we're also looking at virus reduction.
Historically, where we've had Dicot available to us as a total herbicide, then we had the opportunity to make that application up until really about 40% crop emergence without significantly affecting crop development and ultimate yield. Now, in the absence of Dicot, then we're using other products, PPO products, which are pretty effective, but they are harsher on the crop. So we need to be at 10% emergence really as a latest point of application. So obviously that's given us some challenges in terms of sprayer workload, particularly if we're separating that PPO application from residual application, and timings need to be that much more critical really. So far we've been able to do that. We've had opportunities this year because there's been no issues in terms of being able to travel, but yeah, it does put greater pressure on sprayer workload for sure. Good crop observation as well. I mean, making sure that you're in the fields and really timing that well, because on a warm, light, sandy soils, we can move from no emergence to sort of 20 or 30% emergence within 48 hours sometimes. So we need to be on the ball to make sure we don't miss those opportunities really.
Well, herbicides have undergone major changes over the last few years. I was involved with the previous Spotty site where we were looking at residual replacements, and now we've lost our most recent loss of chemistry was a contact herbicide, Dicot Retro, and now we're looking at the options to replace Dicot. This was a demonstration plot that we had here rather than an actual replicated trial, but we were just trying to demonstrate that compared to the previous chemistry, Dicot, the new options, which are Gozai and Shark, which are both PPO inhibitors, are much harsher on emerged potatoes. So what we've done is spray the trial pre-emergence at 10% emergence and 80% emergence. And what you could see from the trial or the demonstration is much more significant damage on the later applications.
So directly behind me is the herbicide trial, and then to your left, where the white canes are, is a desiccation trial. So that'll come in towards the end of the season, where we'll look at different techniques for desiccating crop, because the use of Dicot was very widespread in that process as well. So we've now obviously got a limited choice of products, but the PPO products are very important within that. But also there are other techniques that are being looked at in terms of horn pulling and potentially applications of salt and that sort of thing. So that'll look at different techniques and also skin set as a result of those techniques.
We'll just highlight to growers when and where we should and shouldn't use these products and what the limits are with these products. But this is to just demonstrate the importance of timing to the growers, and what we'll see from the demonstration plots as we go forward from here is how much effect that has on the growth of the crop and then potentially the yield going forward. You know, we always talk about trying to get 2 weeks extra growth at the end of the season, but what we're doing by burning the crop off too late, then we're actually losing crop growth at the start of the season.
We've got a crop of Lenormand, which is a white potato grown for the baking market, for the supermarket, so on pretty light sandy loam soil. And you can see in the background the herbicide trial where we've looked at different timings of PPO applications and different PPO applications and combinations, and you can probably pick out the differences in crop development a little bit and the effects of some of those later timings of those PPO products.
For growers, traditionally it's always been a one application herbicide just prior to emergence. It means the timing of that herbicide is much more critical. So some might move to a two-stage application with residuals earlier and then follow up at emergence, just to mean so that they're not quite so time critical on that application as they're just about to emerge. On other trials we're working on the spot program this year, we're looking at a virus reduction, and this trial aimed at seed production, which James Foskett Farms is involved with, seed potato production. So we're looking at various different combinations of a new chemistry, adjuvants, and also looking at oils in terms of can we reduce the virus transmission into seed using these alongside current insecticides that we've got.
So there we go. It's not quite the same as being stood in a nice sunny warm field with a bacon roll in your hand, but it's a one way of showing what we were doing at Spot East last year. And the one thing that I took just from looking at those pictures, Mike, is that the phyto damage didn't seem to be quite severe considering the dry conditions we were in.
Yeah, that's probably fair. I still think that, you know, when you look at the later timing of application, when actually got close up to the crop, which you probably couldn't see there, that some of the damage I think was still quite severe. But yeah, it's just about not losing growth at that early part of the season, really.
Yeah, that's one thing I'd made a note of. So now would be a brilliant time to bring in Graham Tomalin from VCS Potatoes. VCS Potatoes were responsible for carrying out that trial on behalf of AHDB, and Graham is here in person to actually deliver some tangible results. As fantastic as that video is, it shows a snapshot in time, but Graham can now join us with some hard results from the trial. So I'll hand over to you, Graham.
Thank you, David. Afternoon, everybody. I'll apologise in advance if you hear chickens, dogs, or parrots in the background. It's the menagerie I've got surrounding my office, but I'm sure we'll get through it okay. Right, so if I call up the screen here, hopefully that is sharing my screen now. Right, so we've been involved with the Spot Farm project now for 5 years in terms of herbicide. So that's VCS UK and VCS Potatoes. Initially, we were targeting replacement of Linearon, so we knew the residuals were going to be lost, or Linearon was going to be lost. And on sandland production, Linearon was a mainstay of our residuals. So that was the start, and the first 3 years focused on Linearon replacement. Following that, we learned of diquat being lost, so then we've moved on from that, and the last 2 years has been demonstrations looking at the loss of diquat and potential replacements. So in 2020, it was quite a small demonstration really that we were looking at. It was just a demonstration of the contact activity of the two potential replacements. So the field site, the field 922A, it was a sand or loamy sand field. We had the same variety as the crop, with the field, which was Lenormand. Planting date was 10th of April. This demonstration was just purely to look at the damage to the crop, or as it was coming through, and not to look at weed control data. So I'm not going to go through any weed control data at all. So going through the treatments that we had here, there was 8 treatments, but in effect they're in blocks of 4 block pairs. So the first 2 were no applications at all and a residual applied. So the residual was applied well before emergence, 24th of April. Residual on all the other plots also had the residual at the same time, which was an emerger, 1.75 litres, and shot put 250 grams. So the next pair of plots were Shark and Kabuki, which were applied just pre-emergence. So it was also actually applied on the 24th of April. So there was any emergence at that time. The following pair from that was the same 2 applications, Kabuki, which is the same as Gozai. It's just the trade name of the product that we actually used on the trial or demonstration. And that was applied at 10% emergence on the 6th of May. And then we followed up quite quickly. We were targeting 50 to 80% emergence, but the crop was moving very fast this spring. So we applied again at 80% emergence, and that was the 11th of May. So if you look at the ground cover observations through this demonstration, these are the first pair of treatments, so the untreated and the residual, and there was very little difference between these two. They matched each other completely through. This is a graph of ground cover over the dates along the bottom. It's ground cover increase, so going from 0 up to nearly 100%. So then you add in the next two. So these were applied pre-emergence, so at the same time as the residual. And what you could see here is there was a very slight difference there, but no major difference. The kabuki was slightly lower in terms of ground cover development. So we had the next pair. So these are the bottom two lines, so the grey and the light blue line at the bottom. So these were applied at 10% emergence. And what you can see here is you're seeing a slight change in the ground cover. It has to be said this year we had fantastic growing conditions, so the crops recovered very quickly, but there was marked difference here between the first two. And if we go to the last one, which is the 60 to 80% emergence target, that's the brown and the blue line at the bottom, which was lower still on ground cover. And if you take away all the intervening applications in the middle, you can see the difference now is more marked between the untreated and the residual only applications at the top and the kabuki and shark applied at 60 to 80% emergence. As Mike said earlier, you know, this is a sort of a necessary slowdown on the crop. You know, do we want this? We always look at the other end of the season and trying to maintain crop growth to get to full yield at the other end and trying to burn off in time so we can harvest before we get too wet in the autumn. But if you lose crop here at the start and losing ground cover, you are losing yield at the start of the season. So this is quite interesting. So if we do some photo comparisons here, on the left-hand side was no residual or contact application and nicely at rosette. And you compare that to the harshest treatment, 60 to 80%, shark in the middle and the kabuki on the right-hand side. If you look very closely at the plants, the ones that are actually there that are green are the slightly later emerging, and the ones that we actually sprayed off are completely brown at this stage. However, as I said before, we had such a fantastic growing spring that, looking along the plots here, so the two white canes are the mark between this trial and the next trial. But this trial, there was very little difference as we were approaching full canopy cover between the treatments, despite that quite harsh knock. However, in a different season or on heavier soil or a wetter time, slower growing, or you may get a much greater delay, and then you would see a much bigger difference in the ground covers. And also, if you had disease present in terms of rhizoctonia or blackleg, I'm sure by knocking the crop harshly at that early stage, you may have exacerbated the disease. So it is an important aspect. We also did observations of stunting on this, and as you can see, it's as you would expect. You know, there was no stunting in the untreated and residual. As soon as you start to apply later and later as you move across, the blue line was the first observation. The later you applied, the greater the stunting in comparison to the untreated. And what you're seeing with as you go down the blue to the orange to the grey, that's as time proceeds. So the stunting becomes less and less marked over the three regions that we had there. So over a 14-day period, it was much less marked than on the untreated, but still a difference. In addition to on the pictures here, you've got the left-hand side, you've got the direct Ppo Scorch, which we've all seen, which is quite harsh and knocks the crop back. We also made some observations this season, and this wasn't on this demonstration, but elsewhere, that you saw some leaf puckering or damage to the outer margin of the leaf. Crop grew back very quickly from that, but I feel it's when the leaves were just on the point of emergence and the outer margins just got slightly scorched by the product. And then you see this growth on the right-hand side picture. You can see this growth of the leaf sort of puckered around the bit of damage. So it did grow back fairly quickly where I saw this, but it was worth noting that this effect did never really see this with Dicot in the past. So then concluding on what we've found here from Gozai and Shark, I've gone back to Gozai now. So yeah, the strengths of these two products are generally broadleaf weeds, and I'm not going to list out all the broadleaf weeds, but they've both got very good activity on the majority of broadleaf weeds. They both have no activity on grass weeds. So if you're looking for grass weed control, your only option, not on seed crops, but on wear crops, would be a glyphosate application 7 days pre-emergence. Other broadleaf weeds, there is differences between the two products. Shark is a little bit poorer on chickweed, mayweed, and larger groundsel. And I've seen observations that Gozai, if you get larger fumitory and not grass, sometimes the activity is a little bit less. But they are good replacement options for Dicot that we've had in the past, but we just need to make sure we apply earlier. In addition to this, knowledge of the weed spectrum will also help to aid efficient control, because we want to target which one of the two products here is best. Another note is co-application with residuals will improve control. Aclonophen and metribuzin will both give some contact activity on the weeds, and will certainly enhance activity on groundsel in the case of metribuzin. Aclonophen will enhance activity on fat hen. And also, as I noted before, effect on early canopy. If we apply later than 10%, it's definitely greater than Dicot, but dependent on season will be how much effect you have on the crop. So in effect, we're drawing to a close on spot farm herbicides. We've looked now for 5 years. Just going through some of the other work here, this can all be found online, but we did work on single actives in terms of residuals. A lot of this pulled out here. You can see activity on fat hen and showed that aclonophen was very active on fat hen, and some of the other residuals had no activity on fat hen, such as flufenicet or gamete. Another part of the work, this was the conclusion on the residuals here. There was 2 main new residuals we looked at and focused on: Emerger and Praxim, aclonophen and metabromiron. I'm not going to go through the weeds here, but they're both mixer products. They're not products to use alone. They've got strengths, but they've also got weaknesses as well. But in the main, options for linearon replacement existed. But it's really important to know the knowledge of your weed spectrum now to get the best out of these residuals. Quite often, metribuzin is our most effective residual herbicide now, but it's also damaging for certain varieties, and we need to be careful on certain soil types. So it's what levels of metribuzin we can use and on those varieties, and which other residuals we're combining in. We found generally that 3 residual active ingredients used in applications gave us a broader range of control of weed species. Other work, and again, I won't go through this completely, but other work we did, and it can be looked at if you go back, was post-emergence herbicides. These were just, again, demonstrations, but we looked at varieties that are on the label, but we also looked at varieties that weren't on the label, and this was Bazagran. And we tried to grade the sensitivity of the varieties to Bazagran as a post-emergence herbicide. And we've added to some of that work. In addition, we looked at metribuzin post-emergence, and here again, I've tried to grade the tolerance to the highly sensitive varieties. So the tolerant and low sensitivity you may apply post-emergence, generally at lower rates than recommended on the label. You can get quite good activity on a lot of weeds at lower rates than there is on the label. But the moderate and the high sensitivity, you would be very reluctant to go anywhere near these post-emergence. And it must be noted, as the previous slide, these variety lists, they're 1 or 2 years demonstration results. They're not a recommendation to apply. There's lots of factors to take into account in terms of stress on crops, soil type, but they're just a guide for us as agronomists as to where we can and can't use these products. So that is concluding the work from Spot Farm. We actually had another herbicide trial adjacent to the trial. You probably saw it in the background from the earlier pictures. And this is yet another residual herbicide that may gain approval in the near future, VAS 656. I'm just going to go through some of the data. We were going to look through some of this on site if we've been able to get out there early this year. It's a pre-emergence active with root and shoot uptake, but it is a partner product, so it's a tank mix option. Again, it's not a standalone. We've looked at it in combination with other herbicides as it's a partner product, and the trial here was looking at a range of varieties with sensitivity to metribuzin to see whether there was any similar sensitivity to the new active. And what we had was 4 beds here. You can't quite see it, but 4 beds of different varieties, and then we cross sprayed the new active across them. So just looking at activity, there wasn't too many weeds on the site, but the small nettle, groundsel and mayweed that was there was well controlled by the VAS 656. When you look at phytotoxicity across the 4 varieties, this is Marfona, this one's Maris Pear and Maris Piper, BR808. There was very slight phytotoxicity, but no great phytotoxicity. No difference between the varieties. There's a difference in ground cover between the varieties there, but that's just down to the different the speed of the growth of the different seed lots that we had on site. When you then combine the new active with metribuzin, we did see some phytotoxicity. So the picture third along from the left, you can see the yellow in here on the leaves. This is on VR808, which is a metribuzin sensitive variety. So this is nothing to be surprised about. And you compare that to metabromiron, very similar level of phytotoxicity, both caused by the metribuzin in the mix. Whereas when you combine with aclonophen, there wasn't any phytotoxicity observed. So overall, compared to other vegetable crops that I work in, we actually have a good range of AIs for pre-emergence residual control in potatoes, and we may get some more. Low meal organic soils have a heavy reliance on metribuzin. Metribuzin is a real key active, and hopefully we can keep metribuzin approved in the future. We've got to be aware that a lot of the residuals that we have a limited range of activity. So knowing the weed species that you've got on different fields actually helps a lot to know which residual to target. There's limitations on sandy soil types with some actives such as metribuzin and gamete. We also have limited post-emergence herbicides for broadleaf weed controls. Black bindweed in particular is still a problem on silt and organic soils, particularly if you've got metribuzin sensitive varieties. The other area where we've still got issues is post-emergence resistant blackgrass or ryegrass in addition. There's still areas that are a challenge for us to control. So I'd like to thank all the people that have helped with the trial work that we've done, the different Spot Farm hosts that we've worked with, James Foskett's, Elvedon Estates and Godfrey's as well.
Brilliant, Graham. That was a very concise summary of everything that's done. And there's several years now we've been looking at this. And while we're never in a completely settled environment around actives, there's nothing jumping out to us at the moment at risk of going. There's a few questions have come up. And I suppose the one bit that I'm written down earlier was the bit about the 2 weeks extra growth lost at the start of the season. Weed control is obviously a huge challenge. Are allowing a few weeds through by spraying earlier less of a risk to the crop than hitting it hard and knocking it back a fortnight in the spring?
It depends on the weed species. Potatoes are good at out-competing, so if it's weeds that they'll out-compete with, it'll be less of a worry. But if it's weeds that will actually grow up through with the crop, then you'd be more concerned. Fat hen in particular, what looks like a low level of fat hen, if you leave it, can turn into quite a mess. And same with bindweed as well. So you have to weigh up, and that's weighing up really which route you take.
Yeah. And another one was just clarification. Obviously, we were looking at shark and gozai or kabuki in the trial, but being mindful about rates you're using at the front end of the season and impact that may have on what you left available for desiccation.
Yeah, and that's been helped a little bit by the labels, but yeah, you've got to be mindful if you use it the gozai early in the season, whereas with the shark and spotlight are separate labels, but if you use up some of your gozai at the start of the season, you may have less available for later in the season for desiccation. Yep. So if you want to save it, if you've got difficult crops to desiccate, like marquees, for example, then you may want to save it and use shark in earlier.
And then if we could bring Mike back into this conversation. So Mike, did you, obviously you were in those crops far more frequently than I was, and probably more frequently than Graham was as well, throughout the season, just by the nature of it. Did you learn anything in particular from looking at the trial in passing?
Yeah, I suppose it reinforces that timing of that, contact herbicide. That's, I suppose, the message that you take home, and that's the message that my sprayer operator brings back to me as well. He picked up on that. I suppose, there wasn't vast amounts of weed pressure in there, but thinking generally about our herbicide experiences this season, generally I'd say we achieved pretty good control. By and large, we've been a one spray program, and I would probably err on the side of being early and compromising weed control slightly rather than knocking crop too much. Generally, we're on fairly short duration growing season down here, and we're trying to maximize every day of sunshine and water that we've got to grow the crops. And I suppose the other thing as well is, I'm a believer in the fact that, the potato canopy is a pretty rapidly growing, vigorous beast that does help from a competition point of view. And also, I guess we've been able to pull in certain, husbandry techniques that we do on the organic side of the business to give us some physical control of weeds where we've needed to do that. So re-ridging, raking, those types of techniques that we can sometimes employ, which will, if we need to, give us some control of late emerging fat hen and things like that.
Because another thing that you've written down was, for you, Mike, is it more of a challenge around varietal susceptibility to like some metribuzin, or is it soil type that gives you the biggest headache when planning your tank mixes in season?
I suppose it's about going through pre-season and trying to understand the range of species that we're likely to encounter as weeds in those fields, and then targeting the residual program around that. And obviously the metribuzin is tailored according to the varieties really, and we're on pretty light soil types as well, so anything that's sensitive to metribuzin we've got to be pretty careful with, and so we're being perhaps slightly more robust in our other residuals that we're mixing into that, and then obviously trying to make that if we're going with a one spray program, trying to get that timing right, but as I say, probably erring slightly on the earlier side rather than pushing it too late. Because the other thing as well, we've got to be a bit mindful that suddenly you get a few warm days, suddenly you can have a lot of crops that you need to get herbicide on quite quickly, and if the weather closes against you or the wind gets up, then we can be in a bit of a tight spot.
Yeah, and so a question coming here about increased herbicide efficacy using liquid N as water when applying residuals, particularly with metribuzin sensitive varieties, applied through angled nozzles with water, if necessary, at high rates to increase coverage. Also saves a top dressing pass. Has anything been done in trials? Not that I'm aware of. Graham, have you come across this at all in professional capacity?
No, I haven't in trials. I mean, I have seen the effect of top dressing using the liquid N, and I have seen the effect on crop that was just emerging and weeds. And yes, some weeds are knocked out by it. Quite often people don't apply with angled nozzles and apply with dribble bars, and then you get very concentrated spots of scorch on the crop. And this is on the crop just as it's coming through. If it's coming through, I would never recommend it on the crop. You need to apply it pre-emergence, really. But yeah, I've seen it, but I haven't seen any trials for using liquid N and which weeds it will knock out or not.
You partly answered the second question here about would liquid N have the same desiccant effect as dicot on small weeds? If concentrated enough, from what you're saying, it's going to fairly knock them, but it's getting that targeted application that'd be the challenge.
It will knock them, yeah. It will. Some weeds it will. So it would be a route that some people could go down. Yeah.
And so just to jump back to the trial, then the trial was that was just it was a commercial crop planted rather than being hand planted, and then the different treatments. So there wouldn't be human error in planting depth if they were hand planted.
It was, it wasn't hand planted. It was commercial planted crop that we had there.
So then another question that's come in. With label restrictions, does pre-em herbicide programs start with a choice of desiccant later in the crop, as growers are going to need them all? So basically, similar to what we've said. So do you need to be thinking more about what you're planning at the end before you start at the beginning, or should you just very much focus on a nice clean crop, getting the crop away early without hitting it and doing the damage?
I think it's weighing up what your desiccation program is likely to be. If you're a flail and spray activity, and if that's the route that you go down, then I suspect you'll be okay using whichever one of the PPOs you want at the start of the season, because you've probably got enough in the locker there for the desiccation. But if you're trying to desiccate a crop of marquees and full canopy without a flail, then you're likely to need everything you can at the end of the season, and you would probably take the approach of using shark as an option if you need a pre-emergence contact herbicide in the mix.
And this is possibly even one for you, Mike. I don't know if you've played about at all, but someone's asking if there's a case for mixing half rates of kabuki and shark.
Yeah, possibly. We haven't done, which for whatever reason we tended to go with kabuki or gozai earlier on. We've probably found it to be a little bit stronger on groundsel. Groundsel can be an issue for us in some circumstances, and I haven't necessarily needed to keep gozai for the tail end of the season, because we've pretty much been flail based with a following Spotlight Plus application. So we haven't necessarily done that, but so far we've managed to achieve most of what we want to achieve just by going with gozai generally.
And Graham, can you see any merit in mixing the two? Obviously, it's something we looked at in desiccation trials, but we didn't look at the front of the season.
I wouldn't necessarily see any benefit of mixing the two. I think that would just add a complication. I think if you've got weeds that sharp maybe a weaker on, so if you've got mayweed or chickweed, then you would go with gozai. Unless you needed it for the desiccation, you would use that if those weeds species are present.
Yeah. Another one picked up that it was mentioned during the talks was glyphosate in high blackgrass situations. Question, Mike, are you brave enough to go down the glyphosate route, and how comfortably do you sleep at night when you know you put an application on?
Well, we haven't used glyphosate. We haven't really been in that situation. I suppose we're relatively fortunate in that grassweed pressure is not horrendous, and probably a bit more restricted to patches of fields and headlands, etc. Yeah, always makes me nervous though. Always makes me nervous if you do something like that, because you just have to convince yourself that your crop walking has been completely thorough, and particularly where we're using different seed lots in fields, or seeds that have had different warm-up regimes or different chronological days to them, then Emergence can catch you out. But yeah, it's there, and providing you are robust, then it's there as an option. But it's not something we do a lot of.
And it's the same to you, Graham, obviously in an advisory point of view, where does it sit in your comfort zone?
Yeah, Yeah, I mean, I do advise it in quite a number of places where, particularly if we've got black grass or grass weeds or clumps of annual meadowgrass that are left, although they're not crop competitive meadowgrass, the little clumps will stay there under the canopy the whole season, and then when you desiccate, they will then can form a mat. So I do use glyphosate at times, but always obviously you've got to err on the side of caution with the emergence, and if you feel you've got an uneven seed lot and likely to have an even emergence, you've got to make sure you go 7 days pre-emergence.
Because that's one thing actually picking up in this quite light land we've been doing trials on over the years, and thinking especially to some of the fen land with ever-changing soil types, you'll have a huge variation in emergence across the field. Very much, is this a problem you have, Mike, on any of your land, or do you see reasonable uniform emergence across fields?
No, we're fairly fortunate, really. Most emergence tends to be relatively uniform. I mean, as you've seen, we're on pretty light soils there, and certainly in the season like the one we went through, there's plenty of temperature there. There was, some moisture left from planting, so emergence was pretty rapid. I suppose the only slight caveat to that can be successive flushes of fat hen can be a bit of an issue for us. But generally, we're in a position where we can take out 90% of the weed burden in that initial flush normally. Yeah,
and then not want to keep harping back to the organic side, but also you mentioned it earlier in the mechanical weeding. Is this something that you find yourself doing slightly more of it in recent years, and would you consider bringing it in, or is there's obviously the cost to everything? And I know that it was touched upon this morning in the desiccation one, the weed burner, using propane burner, it adds cost. Where would that fit in the conventional system, if at all?
Probably wouldn't fit by design into the conventional system. I think from a workload point of view and from a cost point of view, it's costing circa £100 a hectare to do a pass with the green burner. It's surprisingly effective in terms of taking out weeds up to sort of 1 to 2 true leaf. Generally, it is pretty effective. But yeah, output's not massive. So with our triple bed machine, we might do 20 hectares a day, but it's pretty limited compared to sprayer output. The other thing is, from an environmental point of view, you are burning a lot of gas to achieve that. So from a carbon footprint point of view, it's probably not the best approach. But it's certainly, on the organics, we don't really have any alternatives. So for us to time that at peri-emergence or 10% emergence generally gives us quite a good level of weed control, in combination then with a 3-row planting format, means that we can let that crop get up and make full use of that crop competition to generally give us pretty good control. And then on the back of that, really, then we're doing passes with either Lilliston wheels or ridging bodies or ridging discs in the wheelings, and then into row as well, just before the canopy closes up. And yeah, 99% of the time we can achieve probably, I would say 95% weed control with that strategy.
And then also back to you, Graham, also we mentioned in the video and other times about how dry the spring was. Again, there's a lot of pressure on residuals with the dry conditions. Is that altering your recommendations, what you're seeing out on farm?
Yeah, you would look, really, some residuals work better in drier conditions than others. I mean, it isn't great for any, but in particular, you'd find that pendimethalin is quite poor when it's really dry, although it does hang around for a longer period. So then if you get rainfall afterwards, it can be picked up by weeds that are actually quite big. So you will take it into account at that time, but you're more looking really at the weed species you're expecting in terms of the residuals that you use.
So that be pointing towards certainly a 2, if not 3 spray program in a real dry condition with pendimethalin going on a week or so after ridges have settled in real pre-emergence time, and then possibly going in peri-emergence. If you're
using pendimethalin, then yeah, you want to be at least 7 days pre-emergence. So it depends on different areas. Some people we take a single spray approach. on all of Mike's crops. In other places where I'm at the heavier soil types, where we're loading up greater levels of residuals, we might take a 2-spray approach, and then we'd actually put some residual on 7 to 10 days pre-emergence. And that is an opportunity as well to use glyphosate as well if you've got a problem there. So we'll load up the residual then, and then that would mean that when we come in with a contact, if the weather goes against us or it's windy, we're not under so much pressure to get the contact on because we have got some residual on earlier.
And then sticking on scenarios, I've had a question come in here. What programme would you suggest for blackgrass and a very wide range of broadleaf weeds on peaty soils?
I mean, difficult to say about actually seeing the soils in the field, but yeah, particularly blackgrass, you're looking at flufenicet within Artist. It's a good component. Clonophen has got some activity, and metribuzin. So those 3 are the actives. Would give you the greatest activity on blackgrass. If you've got some blackgrass there, 7 to 10 days pre-emergence, Roundup or glyphosate would be useful in that scenario as well.
Because several times you mentioned about really knowing your weed target is key to getting good control, and something that's come up over the years in questions has always been people's desire to almost make cocktails of herbicides, and whether you're better to have several actives with lower rates or fewer actives with higher rates. And so that all comes back to what you are targeting at the end of the day.
Quite often on the sands we're using 3 actives, primarily because metribuzin rates are really low. So because we're very sensitive soil type effectively, or very light soil type, so leaching can be a problem. So if your metribuzin is low, one other active probably isn't great enough for a wide enough spectrum of weeds.
So, and then another one that links on from that was a question to both of you, but in the terms of pre-potato crop, what do you think the best way is for seedbed preparation, Graham? And what can be done to help relieve the weed burden? And then same to you, Mike. What do you do, or what have you found works best at relieving weed burden ahead of potatoes?
I think from my side, pre the potato crop, you want as fine a seed bed as you possibly can get, or beds. If it's really cobbly, open sort of soil type, then you're not going to get a good seal with the residual, and then your residual control is going to be poor. So yeah, as fine as you can get it. And ideally, if you're doing a split residual strategy and you get a really good conditions, you've had some rainfall, some moisture, then get your first residual on. That's in about that 2 week prior to emergence. Better to get it on in good conditions than wait until it dries out again.
And then for you, Mike, what do you currently do, or what have you found helps relieve weed pressure ahead of potatoes?
I suppose that comes down to just having a clean entry by and large. It depends a little bit whether we're we have control of the field throughout the rotation, or whether it's rented in land. But obviously, hopefully, we're not in a position where we've got established large weeds immediately before we're wanting to cultivate the field. And if it's a stubble, it's been burnt off, or if it's a cover crop, that it's been a well-established cover crop that's established the target species and hasn't let volunteers or other weed species establish in there. I mean, we're primarily plough-based in terms of our primary cultivation, certainly usually in the early part of the season. So generally, that's given us a fairly clean approach. One of the issues we can have a little bit within the organic scenario is where we have cover crops established there. Sometimes we can have a lot of root matter to deal with. It can be a bit of an issue with destoners, and you can have quite a lot of sod and actual roots that can be a little bit of an issue to try and separate. Generally, on the conventional side, it's about just having a clean entry, be that after stubbles or be it after cover crops.
And I suppose going on a slight tangent now, technically the definition of a weed is a flower in the wrong place, and we very much focused on weeds being the enemy here. And when you try to grow a crop of potatoes, they are, but there can be other things where they can be useful. So in the neighbouring field to the herbicide trial, we also had a field of Cymbrifolium and broadleaf trap crop. If you can see on my screen, there's the line there. So we had about a third of the field in Cymbrifolium, a strip in the middle of the Kenyan broadleaf, and then back to the Sicim on the right-hand side. We sampled 18 different points within that field to check the PCN. This was done in the spring. We burnt out 6 areas as per the picture on the right here. And then we resampled the field again in December. And here we have both sets of results. So the results on the left here are the initial PCN testing done in March, I think it was, 2020, with initial populations of 71 here in the bottom left, 49, 41 in the top right. And see these have been reduced to 20, 10, 23. Some of the ones that were sprayed off, for example, were treatments. So number 5 here was one of them. So it's gone from 24 down to 11. So we've seen some natural decline. Treatment 16. Again, we've gone from 53 to 23. So we have seen some natural decline even where the trap crop hasn't been. But in addition to this, that there was also a bit of weed in there. Do you care to comment on that, Mike?
Yeah, no, certainly we struggled a little bit with establishment, and I was listening with interest to the presentation at 12 o'clock today in terms of how we might improve our establishment of trap crops. But I think, certainly the Kenyan broadleaf established a lot better. We had a better plant count in there and a better canopy stand. The standard desist around the outside and on the headlands, we had a much poorer plant stand, and as a consequence then much higher weed pressure. So quite a lot of fat hen established, but also a lot of nightshade as well. To be honest, I'm quite staggered by the level of reduction we've had in what, certainly in the desist areas seem to be extremely sparse in terms of the trap crop. So I'm encouraged, and listening to the presentations by Jamie and Ivan earlier on, I was encouraged even on their comments where they've had low numbers of plants per square meter. They've still actually managed to stimulate the hatch and stimulate a significant reduction in numbers. So it's given me heart to carry on. But there was significant weed pressure there.
And then do you, Graham, with your agronomist hat on as the agronomist at James Foskett Farms, this would be a fun one to manage with the loopholes and challenges around herbicide programs on trap crops?
Yeah, it's been I've been involved with Solanum Cymbrifolium now for quite a few years, and when we get it right, it works very well, and we get some very good crops. Weed control is the obvious challenge. Talking about the PCN testing here, just for everybody, they weren't tested right across those areas. They were distinct 5-meter circles within those areas that were tested pre and post, because we all know how variable PCN can be across an area. So they were really tight, 50 cores in a very small circle there, and the reductions were very good. So it's a challenge to grow. I think the biggest thing is that you need to establish them early enough. I think trying to follow a winter barley is too late. So you're looking at an entry crop. So for me, in this part of the world, vining peas is a good entry. Polly carrots that come off early is another good entry. Or alternatively, the way we're going in the future and the value of cereals and things, there may be people that deem that it would be better to try and reduce the PCN level or PCN burden on land, rather than grow a crop of cereals. That may come in more in the future.
And then, because it is worth mentioning, so this was a roughly about 4.5 hectare field split down into quarter hectare samples, and you did kindly irrigate it for us, Mike, after drilling, because it was a bit desert-like in those conditions. and well, we can see from the pictures earlier, it wasn't the thickest crop, but it definitely seems to have had some effect on there. What we not be in the spot, Mike, but plans for this in future, and how much of a challenge would this be to take out going into a potato crop?
I'll let you know. I haven't had any experience of doing it as yet, but I don't personally envisage it being a massive problem. We follow various other crops in the rotation, maize, and as I say, some of the organic rye and veg cover crops that we follow can be fairly challenging at times, just in terms of dealing with that actual physical organic matter. So I don't know is the honest answer, so I won't prejudge it, but I'll let you know on that one. Just coming back to the establishment, I think, one thing I took out of lunchtime was making sure that we're not drilling that seed too deep. And I think, we'd be better to actually probably irrigate either pre-drilling or immediately post-drilling. We delayed by probably a week to 10 days. There's always a case, there's a bit of rain in the forecast. You think, we'll get it, and we delayed, and probably that irrigation should have happened the day after, or in some cases a couple of days before. And also, I think consolidation, we didn't roll that field, and I think it should have been Cambridge rolled, and I think that would have helped establishment. So I'm certainly think trap cropping is got to be part of our armoury. We've invested quite heavily as a business in terms of PCN testing, post-crop testing, and I think information is absolutely key. Knowledge is absolutely key. Measurements are absolutely key in terms of managing it. And I think trap cropping will certainly form part of our strategy. If we can shoehorn it into the rotation behind polycarrots or behind vining peas, then that's great. But if not, then it may well just have to feature as a standalone crop within certain farms. Because we've obviously lost Vidate, and we need a different approach.
Yeah, so it's everybody aware that AHDB have submitted an emergency application for some sort of continued use of Vidate this season, and that's ongoing. As soon as we have answers, we will communicate that out. But just to bring you into this, Graham, obviously you said you've been involved in it in other sites, and do you think there was anything to play with the nightshade that was in this field and the effect on PCN numbers?
Might have been some of the nightshade occurred in some of the areas that have been taken and sprayed out. So we actually took out the Cisimbrifolium or the broadleaf in the circle. So we had a good comparison with untreated, and then we got some nightshade in there. There's anecdotal data, there's disagreement really as to whether nightshade has any effect on PCN decline, but it is a Solanum species. I think there was a POP trial probably about 10 years ago that suggested that it may help decline of PCN as well. So that might have been some factor in the control plots that we had there.
Yeah. But yes, there's some questions coming in that they were, as you mentioned, Graham, they were GPS points and then samples taken in a radius around that point to try and remove as much sampling error as possible. And these are literally hot off the press into us. So we will do some number crunching and try and get some PFPIs and get some ratios and percentages out of that data that we will share through the usual streams. But just to wrap things up, I suppose I'll start with you, Graham, first of all, if I may, and then come to you, Mike, on your future plans. But what to sum it up, 5 years' work into one simple sentence isn't easy, but is there light at the end of the tunnel, and can we still achieve good levels of weed control without spending a fortune going forwards?
Yeah, I think spending a fortune, costs have definitely increased. That's without a doubt. The new chemistry is more expensive than the old chemistry. We've got enough chemistry in the locker to be able to control most things other than resistant blackgrass. But we've got a nice range really there. Going forward, I think probably don't need too much work in the next few years. As we get more varieties, newer varieties, again, looking at post-emergence metribuzin work is always useful on newer varieties. So as you get a range of new varieties, maybe you revisit that in a few years' time. But provided we maintain the treatments that we've got at the moment, particularly metribuzin, then I'm reasonably hopeful we can maintain good weed control in potatoes at the moment.
And then same to you, Mike, that obviously a lot of the trial work has been done at looking at replacements and slightly firefighting with a whole sort of integrated approach. Can you see prevention as much as treatment of weeds being part of the farm strategy going forward, encompassing IPM and everything across the board?
Yeah, I think so. I think again, it's about knowledge, and I think I agree with Graham. I think we've got the tools in the armory at the moment to pull together a pretty comprehensive weed control strategy in most situations. You combine that with the fact that it's a rapidly growing crop. That generally, you've got a 3 to 4 week head start on your weeds. Then, in the scheme of challenges agronomically in terms of growing this crop and other crops, I think it's quite doable, to be honest. I'd far rather deal with weed control in potatoes than I would in onions, I'll tell you that.
Waiting for them to wax back up again, the joys. Thank you both very much, Mike, for giving us an insight into the business and how you approach things. Graham, thank you very much for summarising not only this year's trial but work before. Thank you all to those of you that have dialed in and joined, asked questions. Presentations will be available after. And as I mentioned at the beginning, this is just one part in a series of events throughout the week. You heard in the beginning there are basis points available, and there's a unique basis code for today's event. The basis code is B13D, and there's also some Eneroso points available as well. Be delighted if you could join us again tomorrow. Tomorrow we'll have a bit of a dive into irrigation. The week continues. That'll be at 12 p.m. tomorrow. So look forward to seeing you there. So yeah, once again, thank you all very much for joining us. And fingers crossed we can see you in a field somewhere in 2021. Thank you very much.